Okay, time to talk about the French Revolution. And if you notice there on your assignment list, I already have a number of things to look at, such as the study guide, which we're going to look at together in a minute, terms of the French Revolution, and your take-home test of the French Revolution, both of which are due next week. And look at that, a nice YouTube video which runs through the French Revolution very fast. That's a good thing to have. Or to look through, okay? Because, yeah, the French Revolution's kind of important. I'm being funny, all right? The French Revolution had a longer legacy and a bigger legacy than the American Revolution by about 20-fold, literally. So let us begin, shall we? There it is. So the French Revolution, one of the major turning points, oftentimes history courses either begin or end with the French Revolution, which begins in 1789. July 14th, 1789. One of the major turning points in the history of the Western man was caused by the simple fact that France, the country, was rich. In fact, it was the richest country in Europe, had the largest population in Europe, could put more armed soldiers in the field than any other country in Europe. All those advantages, and yet its government was impoverished and had no way of channeling the riches of the nation into the treasury, government's coffers, the treasury of the government. Wow, you mean the French Revolution was about money? Yeah, money. Mm-hmm. Liberté, equality, fraternity. Yeah, okay. For 25 years after the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War, the government of France tried to come up with one scheme after another to garner funds for the treasury. The monarchy, who, in the French and Indian War was Louis XV, who his famous statement was, things will last in my time, but after me, the deluge. Deluge is a flood, a catastrophe. Everything falls apart. And his throne went to Louis XVI. And Louis XV didn't care. Louis XVI was a bumbling fool, a schlub. He lacked the desire, tenacity, or the inclination to be the new king of France. But anyway, and it was. Monarchy was seemingly helpless after Louis XIV. Louis XIV set up a system that simply could not be sustained. He could sustain it because he's Louis XIV. But Louis XV and Louis XVI, the kings got progressively worse. Louis XV's financial minister had tried to break the power of the parliaments. You remember we talked about this. That was the Mississippi Bubble scandal. But one of Louis XVI's first acts was to restore the power of the parliaments. Louis XVI was once described as, the primary job of a president or a king or a ruler. The primary job of any ruler is you got to make decisions. Well, Louis XVI was once described as he was the kind of guy who always willing to accept the advice of the last guy he talked to. And when you're king, lots of people talk to you. So, yeah, that's where he went. And Louis XVI, and I hope you're writing, Louis XVI had that remarkable penchant. A penchant penchant is like a habit, tendency, that will be repeated by Tsar Nicholas II of Russia right before the Russian Revolution. He had that remarkable penchant, that remarkable ability to always make exactly the wrong choice at the worst possible time, as we're going to see. He will be too wishy-washy one day and too strict the next. Vertigo. So, by 1781, after financing the French Revolution, the French government, like I told you on several occasions, loaned the American upstarts 20 million gold livres, Livres. And so the government was bankrupt. The debt was larger with no new sources of revenue. The new Director General of the Treasury, a guy named Jacques Necker, actually printed out a report that said the reason why it says held public pensions to nobility and aristocracy as responsible for the large share of the debt. And so he published his report, though, that says the reason why we're in such debt is because the nobility and the aristocracy, the king, they are on the receiving end of all the taxes. His report was not altogether truthful, too optimistic, but it got published. And later on, it made it very difficult for the king to justify raising taxes. Charles Alexander de Calonne, a later financial minister, advocated the lowering of some taxes and to transform the other into monetary payments. Ah, yes, the gabelle. I hope you said, oh, look, it says salt tax on salt. So why is that such an important tax? It was the most hated tax in France. Why was it the most hated tax in France? Because the human beings, like most other animals, need salt to survive. They don't have salt, they die. Well, the French government not only owned the salt mines that produced the salt, they also then made everybody who used salt pay a tax on that salt. It was like taxing oxygen, and everybody knew it. But yeah, that was one of the taxes. And remember again that in France, the first estate, the clergy, and the second estate, the nobility, paid no taxes. And the third estate, made up of everybody else, about 97% of the population, paid all the taxes. And of course, they were greatly resentful for that. Two of the country's three estates, the nobility and the clergy, resisted taxation vigorously. These two groups said that Calonne's reform could only be met with a meeting of the Estates General. The Estates General. Know what the Estates General is. The Estates General was a legislative body that was supposed to represent all three estates. The problem with the Estates General, though, was that each estate at the meeting of the Estate General got only one vote. And so 97% of the population, the third estate, always found themselves being outvoted by the first two estates, who had all the advantages. So Louis XVI backed down and dismissed this guy Calonne, replaced him with the more moderate Ariane, Charles, I love these names, de Brienne, the Archbishop of Toulouse. Yeah. And chief opponent of Calonne at the Assembly of Notables. Brienne tried to arrange a payment of the French debt through the payment of a land tax, misspelling Horton, of a land tax. That was rejected by the Parliament of France. The clergy as a whole rejected the idea and refused the subsidy, but also reduced its existing contribution or don gratuit to the government. You say, Mr. Horton, what does that mean? Well, it means that the clergy actually did pay a tax that was voluntary. That's the don gratuit. And because the clergy didn't like the idea of tax reform, they said, well, we'll just pay less taxes over here. A tax that, once again, they were not required to pay at all. The nobility wanted a restoration of their privileges that Cardinal Richelieu had taken away under Louis XIII. Brienne resigned, and Jacques Necker replaced him. The aristocracy and the clergy had brought the monarchy to its knees by making Louis XVI cave in. And that's basically, that'll happen to Louis XVI all of his life as king. He really was a bumbling fool. He's an interesting study. He was. Louis XVI married Marie Antoinette. I'm talking now, and The notes aren't here. You got to write this down. He married Marie Antoinette. Marie Antoinette was an Austrian princess, about 16 years old when she came to Versailles. Pretty vivacious, and everybody hated her guts. And they just made up reasons not to like her. It began with the fact that she was Austrian, first of all. And because Austria had so recently been the enemy of France, which is why the marriage happened, to make a bond of friendship between France and Austria. And so they are married, and once again, the customary wedding of the French king who gets married, and then they go to the wedding bed, and the nobles go around, and they sit on the bleachers, and they watch. And nothing really happens. And in fact, nothing happens for quite some time. Nothing happens. No son or daughter or children. Louis XVI had a condition, and I'm trying to remember the name of the condition. I can't remember it right off the top of my head, but the condition makes sexual arousal very painful, and so it didn't happen. Now, Louis XVI, that situation could be fixed with a simple surgical procedure, but Louis XVI was terrified of the surgical procedure, and so he didn't have it done for the longest time. And during that time, of course, the newspaper made tremendous allegations against Marie Antoinette that it was her fault, that she was holding out on Louis XVI. Others made jokes about Louis XVI. Louis XVI, he really had I won't say the mind of a child, but, he was really aloof. And one of his hobbies were locks, assembling and making locks. And of course, they had all kind of songs and things like that saying that the locksmith can't find the keyhole, and, that kind of thing. I'm not kidding, and publish them in papers, that kind of thing. So, but when the surgical procedure happened, Louis XVI ended up having like 5 or 6 kids. Bang, bang, bang. So, still didn't satisfy the press. They still hated Marie Antoinette. They called her Madame Deficit. Because, the press made a big deal out of the fact that she bought lots of stuff. Why did she buy lots of stuff? Because she was the Queen of France, and that's what the queens of France had been doing. And why? Because, during the time that Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette were having fun at Versailles, where every day was literally a party, every day there was some kind of cotillion, every day there was some kind of theatrical performance, every day, people sat around and played cards all day and gambled and did this, that, and the other. But the great majority of the 24 million people of the rest of France went hungry. In fact, in 1789 France, starvation happened. People died. Bad bread, bad wheat harvest, And not only that, the year of 1789 was one of those years when the Little Ice Age made itself known in France. Brutal winter, shortened growing season, and things were going badly. So when the aristocracy forced Louis XVI to call together the States General, they had won a victory over the. Sorry, I've got it. That's this one. They had won a victory over the king, but it's on their own doom. Yeah, that was where it all started, at this meeting of the Estates General in 1789. That in July they called together. No, it was June. They called together this meeting of the Estates General, and in forcing him to bring everybody together so they could, the first 2 estates could basically establish their control over the way things were going. They had won a victory over the king, but that victory over the king is going to turn into many of their death warrants. So, the representatives of the bourgeois and the aristocracy both had reasons to hate Louis XVI. Okay, let's make a diagram, shall we? These are things I normally write on the board, but we don't have a board. However, that's not where it ends. There is, at the top, is this thing called the bourgeoisie. Bourgeoisie. I always have trouble spelling that word. The bourgeoisie. These are the doctors, lawyers, professionals. Two. Three. And then, well, You see them all. But yeah, this is worth noting and worth memorizing. The first estate, second estate, third estate made up of three tiers, okay, with the peasants making up 80% of the population on the bottom. So, representatives of the bourgeoisie and the aristocracy both had reasons to hate Louis XVI. Yeah. The aristocracy and the middle class did not trust one another. Some historians believe the fall of the monarchy and the confusion of times left a political vacuum. I don't even think I'm going to keep that. Sorry. And what we're going to do says cut. Hasta la vista. Yes, there is no, the revolution and debate were discussed widely through printed materials that were read widely all across Europe and the world. Yes. There's not really no historical consensus right now for exactly who the main adversaries were in this debate that became a revolution. Okay. At Roman 4, at the meeting of the three estates quarreled, and the third estate made it clear that they no longer want to be ruled by the monarchy. And there were all kind of feelings about this. Some people said we should eliminate the monarchy altogether. Other people said we need a stronger monarchy. Pardon me. Others said we need a constitutional monarchy like they have in England. So, pardon me. The aristocracy made two moves to thwart the third estate. Third estate, sorry, demanded an equal number of representatives for each state. The Parliament of Paris then ruled that each estate would only have one vote, which, once again, third estate was still outvoted. The Royal Council then decided to give the third estate the same number of votes as the first two votes, which accomplishes nothing because now 97% of the population have two votes, 3% of the population has two votes, nothing. The representatives of the estates brought to the council with them good word cahiers de doléances, or list of grievances, the most overriding of which was the demand of the cahiers for equality of rights amongst the king's subjects. On June the 1st, 1789, the members of the third estate invited the other two to join them and to declare themselves as the National Assembly. Here's what happened. Yeah, on June the 1st, so they were meeting, and members of the third estate invited the other representatives of the other two estates to join them, and they were going to set up a national parliament, a national legislature, and they would call themselves the National Assembly. And one day they showed up at the the giant meeting hall there in the Tuileries Palace, and the door was locked. Louis XVI, who got kind of nervous about what was going on, so I'll just show them if they're making all these terrible suggestions that I shouldn't be ruling. We'll show them. We'll just lock the doors. That way they can't come in. Once again, Louis XVI and his penchant for doing exactly the wrong thing at exactly the wrong time, comes through again. And so he locks the doors. And the members of the Third Estate, and actually a few members of the First and Second Estates, kind of join up with them. And they go into this. They call it a tennis court. It's actually a handball court. And they all joined together and they took what they called the tennis court oath, where they vowed not to disband until the French had a constitution. Yeah. Okay. And that was on June the 20th, 1789. So, of course, the beginning of the revolution was the fall of the Bastille. Now, what was the Bastille? The Bastille was a prison. It was an old fort that had been converted into a prison and was also a place where they sometimes kept weapons. You know, you'd think logically that if you're a prisoner, there's weapons. And Louis the 16th, the king, once again, always willing to make the wrong move at exactly the wrong time, he gets really nervous about, this meeting of the Estates General, the tennis court oath. And so what he does, Louis the 16th quietly calls up the French army to settle in, to encamp itself around the outskirts of Paris. Well, it's very difficult to have several thousand armed soldiers camping out right outside the outskirts of the city without somebody seeing them. And sure enough, word gets into the city. And because they've done this before, the French government has done this before, where they call up the soldiers, and the soldiers come in and wreak havoc on the common people. And so the citizens of the city of Paris began to arm themselves, and they arm themselves with anything they get their hands on, machetes, pitchforks, scythes, and yeah, some of them had muskets, and they needed ammunition and more muskets. And so suddenly somebody said, "There's plenty of muskets and ammunition in the Bastille." And so they go to the Bastille. Now, the Bastille was run by, and I can't remember the name. His last name started with an M, but he was there and he was commanding things. And the crowd shows up, and he locks the door and says, "You guys go on home." Well, the crowd wasn't going home, and then he invites the leadership in to parley, to talk. And so they sit there and they talk for a while. And while they're in there talking, the mob gets bigger and bigger on the street, and the soldiers who are guarding the fort, and there weren't that many of them. There were only 7 prisoners in the prison, one of whom thought he was the reincarnation of Julius Caesar. But yeah, the soldiers get antsy, and they actually shot a few people. And that makes the crowd go crazy. And they then, rush the door. They bust down the door, and they enter the prison. They behead all the guards. And here's the thing: they would behead these guards. They didn't have sword. They used pocket knives. A lot of the members of these initial revolutionary movements were females. Not only females, they were the famous poisson, Poison. Yeah, looks like poison. Um, the French fish women. These were women who worked the fish market and who handled, the fish market. Paris is on the Seine. The Seine empties out into the Atlantic, and these big boats with tuna would come in there and dump off the fish. Well, these women would take the fish, pick them up, slice them. They always carried sharp knives, and these women were like burly, and they smelled terrible because they dealt with fish all day. But yeah, and a lot of them in the mob were the Poisson. These were women you didn't want to mess with. And so, yeah, they beheaded all the soldiers, literally with pocket knives. And then they get the mayor of the prison. Once again, I forget what his name is, Mornay, something like that. They drag him out in the street and start beating him. And he finally starts begging them, just please kill me. And they obliged him. And then they cut his head off and began a tradition of the French Revolution, which is really ugly. They took the man's head, put it on a pike, and they start going up and down the street with this guy's head on a pike. Mornay, yeah, de Mornay, that was his name. Anyway, all right, so where are we at here? Rome number 5, yes, the Bastille. That, by the way, that day was July the 14th, 1789. Bastille Day, a day more famous by far than the American Revolution. Yeah, so the king banded with the more conservative force of the aristocracy after he had fired his finance minister, Jacques Necker. The populace of Paris, like it says, alarmed at the massing of soldiers, became a mob that stormed the Bastille, murdered several of the soldiers, and de Mornay, that was his name. So, the attack on the Bastille was the first of many crucial journeys, days upon which the populace of Paris redirected the mob. That's what it means, the mob. Redirect the course of the revolution. Yeah, one thing you can say about the French Revolution versus the American Revolution. The American Revolution, and war is war. People are dying. The American Revolution was a bit more civilized. Yeah, just a bit. So Louis XVI, after he heard about this, the attack on the Bastille, the guy was a buffoon. So Louis XVI, on July 14th, 1789, he is informed of the storming of the Bastille, Vive la Liberté, and all this kind of stuff. And in his personal diary, Louis XVI writes one word. That word, nothing, which was reference not to the events of the day, but the fact that he had went out hunting that day and came away with nothing. Yeah. And Louis XVI, so, he's always the wrong move at the wrong time. He comes back to Paris a few days later, even wearing the red, white, and blue of the cockade. The French Revolution cockade. They're new colors, by the way. The red, white, and blue, the traditional flag of France. You see it? And I'm sure you recognize it. That flag is actually the flag of Paris. Yeah. Okay. So let's just one statement from Roman numeral 6, and then I'm going to shut down for the day. And that statement is this. The storming of the Bastille saw the arrival of something called the Great Fear that gripped the nobility. And what was the Great Fear? The Great Fear was the fear that people who have will be taken by people who have not. Because there are a lot more people who were poor, a lot more people who were hungry, a lot more people who were disenfranchised than there were people who were comfortable. And all across Europe, the French Revolution made people go, because they were afraid. And like I said, ideas like democracy, like freedom, like free speech, like all those things, First Amendment rights that we talk about, all those things in Europe will make the ruling classes antsy. All right. And so we're going to end there and pick up again tomorrow. All right. So have a good day. Bye now.